He was born beneath the weight of a world that still believed it ruled the map. The year was 1912, and the British Empire stretched from the crimson deserts of Africa to the rain-drenched jungles of Burma, from the frozen peaks of Canada to the endless coasts of Australia. In that empire's twilight, before the fall, before the wars that would change everything, a boy named John Enoch Powell came crying into a world of certainty and class, of poetry and pride, of an order soon to crumble. He was born in Stekford, a working district of Birmingham, the son of a schoolteacher and a tailor's daughter. His family was modest, neither noble nor poor, rooted in a Middle England that prized discipline, education, and faith in the British idea. Outside their small house, factory chimneys scraped the sky, the air smelled of iron and soot. But inside, the world was made of books. The boy with a mind on fire. From the beginning, Enoch was different. He learned to read before most children could speak in full sentences. While others played in the muddy streets, he spent hours with a candle and a dictionary, memorizing words, testing their taste on his tongue. Language fascinated him, not as a tool, but as a mystery, a power that could shape thought itself. At 5, he was reciting Milton. At 10, translating Latin. At 13, he had devoured Homer, Virgil, and Plato as if they were modern companions. His teachers recognized genius. His classmates saw a boy possessed by the ghosts of dead poets. He walked to school with his head bowed, lips moving silently, his mind living in another century. He was small, pale, sharp-eyed, already carrying that air of intellectual distance that would later both enchant and isolate him. He did not crave company. He craved clarity. The empire's son, the Britain that raised him, was still draped in the illusion of permanence. Children were taught that the sun never set on the empire, that order and hierarchy were natural laws, as immutable as gravity. Maps in classrooms glowed with red, each colony a promise of destiny. To young Enoch, this empire was not merely a political structure, it was a civilization of meaning, a living poem written across the world. He studied the stories of explorers, soldiers, and philosophers who carried the English tongue to foreign shores. In his imagination, Britain was not a nation but an idea, discipline, language, reason. He would later say, the empire was not an occupation, it was a responsibility. Even as a child, he understood that power, like knowledge, came with duty. But beneath that faith, something darker stirred, a sense that empires, like men, are mortal. He saw cracks in the certainty that surrounded him, the unemployment of the 1920s, the whispers of unrest in India, the fear of decline. He could not name it then, but he felt it, the slow unraveling of an age. The young classicist. At King Edward's School, one of Birmingham's oldest institutions, Powell found the world that suited him, rows of Latin grammar, the rhythm of Greek verse, the clean order of logic. He excelled beyond every expectation. His teachers spoke of him with awe and confusion. How could a boy so young carry a mind so old? He read Heraclitus and underlined the line that would haunt him for the rest of his life: all is flux, nothing stays still. It was both revelation and curse. He began to see in history the eternal cycle, rise and decay, conquest and collapse. Empires, like rivers, flowed only to vanish. It was in those years that the foundation of his worldview was laid. The belief that civilization was fragile, that culture was destiny, and that decline always begins with self-forgetfulness. The solitude of the gifted Enoch Powell's brilliance isolated him. He found conversation with adults easier than with other children. While others dreamed of games and adventure, he dreamed of Rome, of the Senate, the legions, the philosophers who had tried to understand fate. He was fascinated not by glory, but by order. In his notebooks, he scribbled quotations from Cicero, notes on grammar, and reflections on mortality. His family, though proud, did not always understand him. His father, a teacher, admired his discipline, but feared his intensity. His mother, gentle and practical, worried that her son's mind burned too brightly. When she asked what he wanted to be, he replied, "A scholar, or perhaps a poet." She smiled, unaware that he would one day become both, and something else entirely, a man whose words would move nations and haunt history. The poetry of duty. By 16, Enoch Powell was already composing his own verses, tight, formal, austere. They were not romantic poems, but meditations on destiny and decay. He wrote of fallen temples, dead heroes, and the silence after empires die. In one of his earliest poems, he wrote, "Not with a cry do empires die, but with a scholar's sigh, for he has seen the dust of Rome and knows that men forget their home." Those lines, written in youth, would echo decades later, when his own words would be called prophetic and condemned. Cambridge. In 1930, at just 17, Powell won a scholarship to Trinity College, Cambridge, one of the brightest lights of the British academic world. He arrived in a worn suit, carrying a trunk full of books and the unshakable certainty that learning was the highest calling. Cambridge, with its spires and whispers of genius, suited him perfectly. He walked its courtyards like a monk among monasteries of reason. While others played and debated politics, Powell lived in the library. He mastered the classics with obsessive precision, publishing papers that professors envied. He seemed less a student than a phenomenon, a reincarnation of the ancient scholars he adored. By 20, he spoke or read at least 10 languages. He could quote Homer from memory, translate Sanskrit, and read German philosophers in their original texts. But knowledge to him was not an ornament, it was armor. He was preparing himself for something vast, though he did not yet know what. The rising storm. The world outside the university walls was changing. In Europe, a dark wind was rising. Fascism, nationalism, the chaos of post-war resentment. Hitler had not yet come to power, but the tremors of destruction were already felt. Powell watched it all with fascination and dread. He saw in the continent's turmoil the same pattern he had seen in his books: the fall of reason, the corruption of ideals, the madness that follows fear. He began to write essays warning that civilization itself was not guaranteed, that knowledge without morality was as dangerous as ignorance. Few listened. The world was too busy preparing for another war. The birth of a vision. In the quiet courtyards of Cambridge, as the bells marked another twilight, Enoch Powell walked alone and whispered lines of Greek poetry under his breath. He was 21, brilliant, restless, and haunted by the thought that greatness and ruin always walk hand in hand. He wrote in his diary, "The empire cannot last forever, but if it must fall, let it fall nobly." It was not ambition that drove him then. It was prophecy. He felt chosen, as though some unseen thread bound him to history's unfolding drama. He would leave academia soon, not because he desired power, but because the world was changing too fast for him to remain a spectator. The child of empire was about to step into the storm. "He who knows history," he once said, "knows the tragedy of man, and yet cannot turn away." And so, with books in his hands and fire in his heart, Enoch Powell prepared to face the war that would forge him into the most brilliant and most feared mind of his generation. When World War II erupted, the bells of Cambridge rang out across the ancient courtyards, their tones solemn, final, and strangely holy. Students who once recited Greek verse now marched in formation. Professors who taught history now watched it collapsing in real time. Among them was Enoch Powell, 27 years old, one of the brightest classical scholars in Britain, already a fellow at Trinity College, already a published poet, already touched by something that felt like destiny. He had spent his youth learning from the dead, Caesar, Heraclitus, Thucydides. But now the living world called to him, and it called with thunder. The empire he had idealized was at war for its soul, and Powell, who believed deeply in duty, could not stay in the library while others fought. "I could not teach men about Sparta," he wrote, "while England burned." And so, the scholar closed his books, folded his robes, and stepped into a world of mud, uniforms, and steel. The call to arms. In 1939, Britain declared war on Germany. The empire was vast but tired. The optimism of the Victorian age was gone. What remained was pride, habit, and fear. Powell, though a civilian intellectual, was determined to serve. He applied immediately to the War Office, demanding to be sent into combat. When told that his academic rank qualified him for an officer's position, he replied sharply, "I did not study Greek to issue memos. I will go where the danger is greatest." He enlisted as a private, one of the few Cambridge Fellows ever to do so. His professors called him mad. His students wept, but Powell was serene. He was following the same logic that guided the heroes of his books. Knowledge meant nothing if not tested by fire. The scholar in uniform training camp was another world entirely. Gone were the marble halls and candle-lit libraries. Now there was shouting, mud, the sting of cold metal against skin. The other recruits mocked him at first. His accent was refined, his sentences precise, his manner distant. He seemed a man carved from a different time, but they soon saw another side, tireless, disciplined, fearless. He learned faster than anyone, mastering drill, weaponry, and maps with the same precision he once applied to Greek verbs. At night, while others smoked and sang, Powell sat by the dim light of a lantern, writing letters and translating passages from Herodotus into his notebook. To him, war was not chaos. It was history repeating itself, another Iliad being written in blood and bureaucracy. He once told a comrade, "The battlefield is the last true school of philosophy. In peace, we dream. In war, we see." Rising through the ranks, his intelligence and intensity were quickly noticed. Within a year, he was promoted to corporal, then to lieutenant. By 1941, he was commissioned into the Royal Warwickshire Regiment and sent to India, the jewel of the empire, and in his eyes, the cradle of its destiny. When the ship reached Bombay, Powell stood on deck as the sun rose over the harbor. He saw temples and smoke, the chaos of the streets, the endless noise and color of a continent he had only read about. To him, it was like stepping into history. Here was Rome's mirror, a vast civilization under imperial rule, ancient and proud, yet governed by foreign power. Something in him stirred. Fascination, admiration, and a faint unease. He saw not just Britain's glory, but its fragility. Empires, he knew, are never eternal. The war in India. Powell's duties were administrative at first. Maps, intelligence, logistics. He served under General Wavell, later under Slim, and was soon recognized for his sharp strategic mind. But he wanted more. He wanted to fight. He applied for transfer after transfer, each time requesting the front. When his superiors questioned him, he replied, "I have come to kill Germans, not to catalogue them." His ambition was fierce, but it was not the ambition of ego. It was the ancient hunger for virtue, the moral perfection of action, the union of thought and deed. By 1943, he was serving in North Africa, where he saw his first real combat. The desert burned by day and froze by night. He watched men die, suddenly, meaninglessly, and began to understand what no book could teach, that history's grandeur is written in human pain. He wrote in his diary, "The Greeks were right. Fate is a wheel and we are spokes. We do not choose. We are turned." The language of war. Even in the noise of battle, Powell's mind was never silent. He carried a small notebook in his breast pocket where he scribbled fragments of poetry between orders and reports. In one entry, written after a night of shelling, he penned, "The guns are the gods of our age. They speak and men obey. Empires fall not to argument, but to thunder." He saw in war both the horror and the order he had studied all his life. Men followed rules even as they destroyed each other. It was to him civilization's purest paradox, the logic of madness. A strange promotion. By the end of the war, Enoch Powell had risen farther than anyone predicted. At just 31, he had achieved the rank of brigadier, one of the youngest in the British Army. He was fluent in several languages, a master strategist, and an intellectual respected by generals. He might have stayed in the military had his true calling not been stronger. When the war ended, he returned to India, not as a soldier, but as a thinker. He was assigned to the Colonial Office, where his job was to assist in the transition towards self-government. It was there, among the politics and passions of the final years of the British Raj, that his idealism began to fracture. He admired India deeply, its culture, its philosophy, its ancient dignity. But he also saw, in its independence movement, the same pattern that haunted his studies of Rome, the empire unraveling from within. He wrote bitterly in one letter, "I have looked into the future, and I have seen the British Empire's ghost walking the earth." The scholar's disillusion. The India he served in was no longer the jewel of empire, but a land on fire. Riots, revolts, and cries for independence filled the air. Powell, once a believer in the noble destiny of Britain, now saw only the inevitability of decline. He respected Nehru, even admired Gandhi, but he felt that the empire's retreat would leave a vacuum no idealism could fill. He saw the rise of chaos, and in that chaos, the shadow of history's old cycle. It was here, amid the end of one empire, that Enoch Powell's lifelong obsession took root. The fear of decay, of transformation, of the loss of cultural identity. He did not yet know how this fear would one day erupt in words that would divide a nation. For now, it was only a thought, a whisper born of history's echo. Returned to England in 1946, he returned to a homeland he no longer recognized. Britain was victorious but exhausted. Cities lay in rubble, the empire was fading, and the air of certainty he had grown up with was gone. He walked the streets of London and saw not triumph, but weariness, a civilization that had survived its own greatness. When friends asked what he would do next, he said, "I will serve, but not as a soldier. The next war will be fought with words." He meant politics. The scholar transformed. The boy who once dreamed of ancient empires had lived to see one dying. The scholar who sought perfection in books had faced imperfection in war. The man who had believed in destiny now believed in decline. Something in him hardened. Not cruelty, but conviction. He would spend the rest of his life trying to save what he thought was slipping away. And so, in 1948, Enoch Powell laid down his uniform, picked up his pen, and stepped into the world of politics. He was 35 years old. He had seen the birth and death of an age. He was ready to fight another battle, this time for the soul of Britain itself. "Those who do not learn from history," he wrote in his journal, "will live to repeat it and die believing it was destiny." The scholar had become the soldier. Now the soldier would become something else, a prophet with words sharp enough to wound a nation. The war had ended, but for Enoch Powell, peace was never silence. It was tension. The kind of silence before a storm, when the air is too still, the light too sharp, and the heart senses that history has merely paused, not changed. He returned to Britain in 1946, a decorated brigadier with medals gleaming against a face that had already seen too much. But beneath that calm exterior, something had shifted. The young man who had once worshipped empire and order now carried a colder wisdom, that all order decays, that power breeds fragility, and that civilizations fall not from invasion, but from exhaustion. He had looked upon the collapse of the Raj, seen the confusion of post-war Europe, and returned home to find a Britain without faith in itself. And he could not stand it. The return of the scholar Cambridge opened its arms to him. He was still the golden son, the brilliant classicist, the prodigy whose mind could glide from Sanskrit to Plato without hesitation. In his early 30s, Powell was appointed Professor of Greek at the University of Sydney, one of the youngest professors in the English-speaking world. There, on the far edge of the empire, he began to rebuild his identity, not as a soldier, but as a philosopher of loss. He lectured with a quiet authority that unsettled even his peers. His voice was steady, each word chosen with surgical precision, his logic unbreakable. He spoke of Heraclitus and Thucydides, but behind every classical reference, his students heard something else, the echo of modern ruin. History, he told them, is not progress, it is recurrence. Those who believe they are free from its pattern are merely asleep. His lectures drew not only students, but politicians, journalists, and veterans. They sensed that this was not a man teaching old texts. He was teaching the anatomy of civilization itself. The cold intellect Powell's mind had always been sharp, but war had honed it into something harder, almost metallic. He thought like a strategist, even in philosophy. Each idea a campaign, each argument a battle to be won. He no longer believed in comfort or optimism. He believed in truth, and truth to him was rarely kind. He once told a colleague, "I do not write to please. I write to reveal, and revelation is never gentle." He lived alone, surrounded by books, sleeping little, eating less. He read for hours without pause, translating Latin poets by candlelight as if trying to resurrect the order of the ancient world through sheer will. Those who knew him said that he seemed haunted, not by ghosts, but by ideas too large for one man to carry. The poet's mask. Amid the intellectual austerity, there remained in him the pulse of the poet. He wrote verses in the old meter, austere and mournful. Unlike the romantic poets of his youth, these new works carried no hope of salvation, only the beauty of decay. In one poem he wrote, "I saw the towers of empire fade, not with a scream, but with a sigh. Men forgot the price they paid, and taught their sons to question why." He sent his poems to publishers under pseudonyms, not wishing them to be judged as political prophecy. But that is what they were. Every line carried a warning that identity, once fractured, is lost forever. The philosopher of fate. In Sydney, Powell developed what would become his lifelong obsession, the relationship between language and destiny. He believed that the health of a civilization could be measured by its words, by how clearly it could name itself, its gods, its fears. When a language weakens, he said, thought weakens. When thought weakens, nations forget who they are. And when nations forget who they are, they die. To him, words were not just tools, they were the architecture of reality. He studied them as one studies the structure of a cathedral, seeing in every syllable the foundation of culture. This belief, almost mystical in its precision, would later shape his political worldview and his downfall. Return to the homeland. By 1949, Powell could no longer bear distance. He missed the grey skies of England, the sound of his own people, the language that shaped his mind. He left his professorship and returned home. Britain, however, was no longer the country he had left. It was tired, rationed, uncertain. The empire was dissolving, its colonies demanding independence. Immigrants from across the Commonwealth were arriving to rebuild the cities that bombs had destroyed. To most, it was renewal. To Powell, it was transformation. And transformation, he believed, was a softer word for death. He felt an unease that would never leave him. "The English," he wrote, "are ceasing to be themselves. The thread is being cut, and they do not even feel the blade." The civil servant. Before politics claimed him, Powell spent a brief but telling time in the civil service. He worked at the Ministry of Health, then at the Treasury, always brilliant, always restless. He rose quickly through the ranks, his reports crisp, his logic unforgiving, but the bureaucracy suffocated him. He wanted command, not compliance. When he criticized a superior for lacking intellectual rigor, he was quietly moved aside. It was a lesson he never forgot, the price of truth in a world that values diplomacy. And so he turned again toward the one arena where words could still have the power of action: politics. Entering Parliament. In 1950, at the age of 38, Powell was elected Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton South West, representing the Conservative Party. His maiden speech in the House of Commons stunned even his opponents. He spoke without notes, his diction precise, his arguments razor-sharp. "The life of a nation," he said, "is not measured by wealth or conquest, but by its continuity, by its memory." The chamber fell silent. Some whispered that a new Disraeli had arrived. Others called him an anachronism, a Roman in a room of merchants. He neither smiled nor basked in the praise. He had no interest in applause. He had come to defend something far older than policy, the soul of England itself, the inner war. Even as he rose in influence, Powell's inner world remained divided. He admired modernity's logic, but despised its rootlessness. He loved his country, yet distrusted its optimism. He believed in progress, but only if it did not erase the past. His friends found him brilliant but cold, disciplined but unyielding. They said he spoke as if from a different century, that his eyes saw patterns others refused to see. In truth, he was living between two worlds, the classical order he worshipped and the chaotic new age being born around him. The vision of Britain, he began to form the worldview that would define his legacy, that a nation's strength is moral before it is military, cultural before it is economic. He believed that England's greatness had come from its sense of unity, one people, one language, one destiny. To lose that, he warned, was to become a ghost wandering in its own ruins. In one private letter he wrote, "I sometimes think I have been born into the wrong era, that I was meant for the dying days of Rome, to watch the marble crack and say it was inevitable. The mind of steel." By the mid-1950s, Enoch Powell had become one of the most respected intellects in Parliament, and one of its most feared. He was incorruptible, unbending, almost inhuman in his discipline. He could quote ancient philosophers in debates, destroy opponents with logic, and walk away as if nothing had happened. His colleagues admired him, but did not understand him. He seemed incapable of small talk, immune to flattery, untouched by doubt. It was as if the war, the classics, and the weight of history had fused within him, creating not just a man, but a force. "I see history," he told a journalist, "not as a dream, but as a machine, and the gears are turning again." He did not yet know that those gears would one day grind him to dust. The scholar had become a statesman, the poet had become a prophet, and prophecy, in the modern world, is always a dangerous gift. The House of Commons in the 1950s was a place still draped in the smoke and fatigue of empire. The marble halls smelled faintly of tobacco, ink, and history. Old men in worn suits still spoke of colonies as if they were eternal possessions, not fading ghosts. But the war had changed everything. The empire was dissolving, the colonies breaking free, the English identity itself beginning to blur. Into this slow unraveling stepped Enoch Powell, the scholar-soldier-poet from Birmingham, carrying with him the cold clarity of one who had studied the deaths of civilizations and now believed he saw his own repeating the pattern. He entered Parliament not as a man seeking power, but as a man on a mission, to restore logic to a nation he believed was sleepwalking through decline. The first speech. His maiden speech was unlike anything the chamber had heard in years. No rhetoric, no sentimental flourish, only precision, austerity, and an almost unnerving calm. The strength of Britain, he declared, lies not in the number of its ships or its gold, but in the unbroken line of memory that binds its people. Destroy that line, and you destroy the nation. The chamber fell silent. Some felt inspired, others felt judged. When he sat down, an older MP whispered, "Brilliant, but frightening." He smiled faintly. That was how truth was supposed to sound. The philosopher in a suit. In the corridors of Westminster, Powell moved like a ghost of another age. He carried no entourage, avoided gossip, and spoke only when necessary. His briefcase was filled not with policy papers, but with translations of Tacitus and Aeschylus. While other politicians courted the press, Powell spent his evenings alone, writing essays on language, law, and fate. He studied Britain the way an anatomist studies a body, coldly, thoroughly, without mercy. He saw decay where others saw progress, disorder where others saw change. To him, every reform that loosened tradition was another brick taken from the walls of an ancient house. He once told a journalist, "A nation is not a collection of policies. It is a continuity of consciousness, the conservative rising star." Despite his aloofness, his brilliance could not be ignored. By the late 1950s, Powell's speeches had made him a rising star in the Conservative Party. He was appointed parliamentary secretary, then financial secretary to the Treasury, a position that gave him a stage and a weapon: words. He spoke of fiscal responsibility with the same gravity he once gave to philosophy. He saw the national economy not as numbers, but as a moral text, a reflection of discipline or decay. In one address, he warned, "A government that spends beyond its means teaches its citizens to do the same. A nation without restraint is a nation without destiny." His colleagues admired his intellect but feared his rigidity. There was no compromise in him. He debated not to persuade but to purify. To him, politics was not negotiation. It was moral geometry. The lonely idealist Powell's genius was also his curse. He found no joy in alliance, no comfort in flattery. He distrusted those who sought popularity. To him, the applause of the crowd was the first symptom of decline. He was a man built for solitude. Even his friends admitted that to stand beside him was to feel the chill of another century. He was unfailingly polite, but rarely warm. His words could wound without anger. He lived alone, read late into the night, and rose at dawn to translate Greek tragedies, which he called the most honest form of politics ever written. When one colleague teased him for reading Homer while others were networking, Powell replied simply, "The Iliad has more to teach about power than any modern memoir." Between the ancient and the modern, what set him apart was not his ideology, but his vision. He believed that Britain's decline was not economic or military, but spiritual, that it was forgetting who it was. To him, the English language was sacred, the British Constitution near divine. He feared that modernization, decolonization, and mass immigration would dissolve the identity that had held the nation together for 1,000 years. He spoke often of Rome, how it had welcomed the world, opened its gates, diluted its strength, and perished. To many, these were intellectual musings. To Powell, they were prophecy. He began to see patterns everywhere, in policy, in population, in culture, all pointing toward the same end: disintegration through kindness, ruin through compassion. "The torch of empire," he said once, "does not go out because it is snatched away. It is allowed to die by hands grown weary of holding it." The reluctant politician Powell's rise continued. He became Minister of Health under Harold Macmillan and later Alec Douglas Home. In that role, he displayed his peculiar mixture of cold logic and moral conviction. He reformed hospitals with ruthless efficiency, cut waste, and demanded merit over bureaucracy. But even here, his philosophical tone unnerved his colleagues. He spoke of public health not as compassion, but as discipline. "Charity," he said, "is not love." It is often an evasion of responsibility. He insisted that welfare must strengthen, not soften, the moral fiber of the people. He saw dependence as the first symptom of decay. In private, he told friends that Britain was in danger of forgetting the stern virtues that built her. He wanted to remind the nation of them, even if it hurt. The making of a prophet. Through the 1960s, Powell's speeches became sharper, darker, more prophetic. He spoke of economics, yes, but also of fate. He began to sound less like a politician and more like a Cassandra, warning a people too busy to listen. His words gathered power because they came from a mind untouched by compromise. He spoke not to please, but to warn. And as Britain's cities began to change, as new cultures, new languages, and new faces arrived from the Commonwealth, Powell's unease turned to conviction. He saw in it not diversity, but dissolution. He believed the empire had returned home, and that Britain, unprepared, was losing itself in the process. He began to write drafts of a speech he had not yet delivered, one that would one day make him both immortal and untouchable. "I see the future," he wrote in his notes, "and the rivers of our cities will run dark with the consequences of our forgetfulness." The inner conflict. And yet, Enoch Powell was not a man of hate. He was, at his core, a man of fear. Fear for the loss of meaning, the death of coherence, the vanishing of continuity. He did not despise the new, he mourned the old. He did not seek power, he sought preservation. But in a changing world, preservation begins to look like rebellion. Those who loved him called him a patriot. Those who feared him called him a fanatic. Both were right. The gathering storm. By 1967, the quiet academic who once quoted Virgil in Parliament had become something else. A man convinced that he alone could see the truth, and that silence would be betrayal. He began to draft the words that would one day ignite a fire across Britain, a speech about immigration, identity, and fate. He showed the first version to a colleague who read it, went pale, and said, "Enoch, if you speak these words, they will destroy you." Powell simply replied, "Then let them." The die was cast. "The man who sees the truth and stays silent," he wrote that winter, "is complicit in the lie." He would not stay silent, and when he finally spoke, his words would divide a nation forever. By the late 1960s, Enoch Powell was no longer just a politician. He was a presence, austere, magnetic, unsettling. He spoke less like a man seeking office and more like one warning of doom. He had become the conscience of an anxious Britain, or its nightmare, depending on who was listening. His speeches were not written to flatter. They were sermons of civilization. He quoted Virgil, Heraclitus, and Gibbon from the dispatch box. His tone measured, his eyes cold with purpose. He had seen the empire dissolve and the post-war order crumble. Now he looked at his country and saw something worse than poverty. He saw amnesia. "A people that forgets its story," he said in one address, "ceases to be a people at all." To him, politics was not about managing the present. It was about defending the past from erosion. He no longer believed he was serving a party. He believed he was serving a destiny. The keeper of continuity, Powell's worldview, was built like a cathedral, precise, logical, and vast. Every stone of it was history. Every arch was language. He believed that Britain's strength came not from its empire or industry, but from its continuity, a lineage of law, culture, and identity that stretched back to Alfred and Chaucer, Shakespeare and Churchill. The loss of empire had not shaken his faith in Britain. It had refined it. The empire, he now said, was merely an expression of something older and holier, the English soul. But he also believed that soul was under attack, not from foreign powers, but from within. In his diary, he wrote, "Nations do not die when they are defeated. They die when they consent to forget who they are." The enemy within. In 1967, Britain was changing faster than it could understand itself. Factories closed. New immigrants arrived by the thousands from the Caribbean, India, and Africa to rebuild the post-war economy. To many, it was progress, a new chapter of inclusion. To Powell, it was dissolution. He saw in the shifting streets of Wolverhampton, his constituency, the metaphor for a deeper fracture. Different languages, new customs, divided loyalties. He feared a slow fragmentation of the English identity he revered. He walked through the neighborhoods quietly, listening. He spoke with old factory workers who felt displaced, pensioners who felt forgotten, immigrants who felt unwelcome. And though he saw human complexity, his mind turned it into pattern, a historical equation that ended always in the same result: decline through dilution. "The world is changing us faster than we can recognize ourselves," he wrote. "And when a man no longer sees his reflection in his neighbor, he begins to fear him." That fear became his subject and his burden. The prophet of decay. To those who admired him, Powell was a seer, a man of principle warning a complacent society of what it refused to see. To others, he was a tragic relic, a man trapped in marble certainties while the world moved on. He believed he was speaking not out of malice, but duty. To him, truth was sacred, even when it wounded. He often said that politicians must choose between popularity and honesty. "I have chosen," he told a journalist, "and I have no regrets." He saw himself as the last guardian of reason in an age of emotion, a philosopher standing before a flood. He wrote in language that trembled with poetry, "I sometimes dream that I am Rome and hear the footsteps of the barbarians. They come not with swords, but with smiles and flags." The academic turned crusader. Inside Parliament, he was a paradox, a man of intellect amid pragmatists. He dissected economic policy with surgical precision, but behind every analysis was a moral warning. He argued that economics divorced from culture was meaningless, that national identity was the foundation upon which all prosperity rested. He told colleagues that welfare without unity was decay, compassion without coherence was chaos. He spoke not as a man of numbers, but as a philosopher of civilization. And like most philosophers, he began to lose patience with politics. He once told a fellow MP, "You do not understand. I am not here to win. I am here to witness." The solitude of vision. By 1968, Powell's isolation had become total. He sat alone in the Commons dining room, reading Greek texts as laughter filled the halls. He refused invitations, rejected interviews, and spent his nights walking alone by the Thames. The more alienated he became, the more certain he felt of his mission. He compared himself to Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess cursed to see the future and never be believed. His letters grew darker, his thoughts more apocalyptic. "The end comes not with invasion," he wrote, "but with indifference." He could see his country changing before his eyes, and he felt that history itself had chosen him to speak, not because he wished to, but because he must. The speech unwritten. That spring, Powell began drafting a speech he would deliver to a Conservative meeting in Birmingham, his home city, the industrial heart of England, now transformed by immigration and deindustrialization. He told no one what he was writing. The manuscript sat on his desk, covered in annotations, its tone somewhere between sermon and prophecy. He quoted Virgil, "Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." He used it not as metaphor, but as warning. In those lines, he condensed his entire life, the scholar's love of the classical world, the soldier's sense of duty, the poet's fatalism, and the politician's defiance. To him, the speech was not about race. It was about history, about fate, about a civilization forgetting itself. But he knew, as he sharpened each sentence, that once spoken, the words would be misunderstood. They would be heard as fear, not philosophy, and he would pay for them. The night before, on the eve of the speech, Powell dined alone in his Wolverhampton home. He ate sparingly, drank water, and reviewed the text one last time. His wife, Pamela, asked quietly, "Are you sure you want to do this?" He looked at her with calm certainty. "If I do not speak," he said, "I will be complicit in the lie." She said nothing more. Outside, rain began to fall, steady, cold, relentless. He watched it slide down the window and thought of the empire's last twilight in India, of Rome's crumbling statues, of words he could no longer keep inside. He slept little. The morning of fire. On April 20th, 1968, Enoch Powell stood before an audience of local conservatives and delivered the speech that would shatter his career and immortalize his name. It began calmly, analytical, measured, even compassionate. But with each paragraph, the temperature rose. He spoke of the social tensions he foresaw, the dangers of unexamined immigration policy, the loss of English identity. He ended with the words from Virgil, the image of the river running with blood, and the room fell silent. No one moved. They did not yet understand that they had witnessed history. "Those whom the gods wish to destroy," Powell said in his closing line, "they first make mad." It was not clear whether he meant his nation or himself. He left the hall in silence. The next morning, the storm began. It began with a murmur, a few headlines, a few radio broadcasts, and then, within days, the voice of one man shook the entire British nation. On April 20th, 1968, in a small meeting hall in Birmingham, Enoch Powell delivered what would become one of the most infamous speeches in modern British history. To some, it was prophecy. To others, poison. The newspapers called it the Rivers of Blood speech. Though he never gave it that name himself, he had only quoted Virgil, the poet of empire and decay. "I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood." He had meant it as warning, not as wish. But the line burned through the country like lightning, igniting every fear and wound Britain had buried beneath its polite silence. Within 24 hours, the man who had once been a rising star in the Conservative Party became the most divisive figure in post-war Britain. The firestorm. The morning after the speech, the telephones at Conservative Party headquarters rang without pause. Thousands of calls, some in fury, others in admiration. Supporters praised him as the only man brave enough to speak the truth about immigration. Critics condemned him as a dangerous demagogue. The newspapers split down the middle. One headline read, "Powell speaks for Britain." Another declared, "Powell the racist." The BBC replayed fragments of the speech on air. Across factories, pubs, and offices, people stopped what they were doing to listen. In that single moment, a scholar's voice, deliberate, precise, austere, became the voice of a nation's anxiety. The reaction of power. Within 48 hours, Edward Heath, the Conservative Party leader, summoned Powell to his office. Heath's face was pale, his words cold. "Enoch," he said, "you have gone too far. You will be dismissed from the shadow cabinet, effective immediately." Powell did not argue. He nodded once, stood, and walked out. He had expected it. He had written every word of the speech knowing it might destroy his career. But as he stepped into the sunlight, facing a wall of reporters and flashing cameras, he did not look defeated. He looked free. "All I know," he told them, "is that I said what I believe to be true. And the truth, though feared, does not cease to exist." The country erupts. By the end of the week, Britain was in turmoil. Demonstrations filled the streets. Dock workers in London marched with banners reading, "We support Enoch." Immigrant communities, terrified and furious, organized vigils and protests, calling his words a spark that could set the country ablaze. In Wolverhampton, Powell's constituency, shopkeepers argued openly. Families divided, friends stopped speaking to each other. It was as if a crack had split through the heart of the nation, and through that crack poured centuries of unspoken fear, guilt, and longing for the certainty of the old world. Powell had not created the division, but he had named it, and that, in politics, is enough to make a man immortal or unforgivable. The scholar's defense. When journalists asked him if he regretted the speech, Powell's answer was immediate. "I regret nothing that is true." He insisted that he had been misunderstood, that he had spoken not against immigrants, but against the recklessness of a government refusing to plan for integration. He warned that uncontrolled social change would destroy cohesion, that compassion without order leads to chaos. But his tone, his metaphors of rivers and blood, were too apocalyptic, too absolute. They carried the rhythm of prophecy, not policy. To his supporters, that was what made him brave. To his enemies, that was what made him dangerous. The poet turned pariah. Within weeks, Powell was banished from the party elite. He received threats in the mail and applause in the streets. He was both celebrated and condemned, his name spoken in whispers or cheers, depending on the neighborhood. He had become a paradox, a man admired by those who misunderstood him and despised by those who never read him. In one interview, when accused of stirring hatred, he said quietly, "To warn of fire is not to desire it." But the nuance was lost. The world prefers heroes or villains, not philosophers. The letters, tens of thousands of letters, arrived at his home, some addressed simply, "To Enoch Powell, England." They came from pensioners, soldiers, widows, factory workers, people who felt that someone had finally spoken their fear. He read them all. He answered many. He wrote in one reply, "I do not rejoice in support born of anger, but I cannot deny the feeling that I have voiced something long silent." The letters piled up until his living room looked like an archive of a nation's confusion. Even those who despised him could not ignore him. He had become the mirror into which Britain was forced to stare. And it did not like what it saw. The shadow of prophecy. In the months that followed, Powell walked through Parliament as a man transformed. Colleagues turned away. Friends kept their distance. Yet the press followed him relentlessly, his every sentence dissected like scripture. He wrote essays defending his speech, expanding his arguments into philosophical meditations on identity and belonging. He quoted Heraclitus again, "We step and do not step into the same rivers. We are and we are not." To Powell, it was not hatred that threatened Britain, it was amnesia, the forgetting of who the English were, the loss of continuity. He saw in every change not progress, but entropy. And he believed that his country, like all great civilizations before it, was already walking unknowingly toward its twilight. The man in the storm. He spent long hours alone, pacing his study, reading the classics, trying to understand whether he had done right. He returned often to Thucydides, to the fall of Athens, to the madness that gripped civilizations when they no longer knew truth from comfort. He told a friend one evening, "It is strange, is it not? The very act of loving one's country can make one an exile within it." The friend nodded, but did not answer. There was no comfort to offer a man who had sacrificed belonging for belief. The turning tide. Outside the walls of Parliament, something was shifting. Polls showed that Powell's warnings had found a vast audience among the working class. He had become the voice of resentment, of loss, of nostalgia, emotions too raw for politics but too powerful to ignore. His words spread beyond Britain's shores, quoted in newspapers from America to Australia. Some called him a prophet of Europe's future. Others called him its past, refusing to die. Powell himself refused to capitalize on it. He did not campaign, did not form a movement, did not soften his tone. He withdrew further into himself, convinced that he had fulfilled his duty and paid the price. "I did not set out to be loved," he wrote, "only to be heard. The iron consequence." In 1969, he was denied leadership positions. His name was blacklisted from key committees. When he rose to speak, benches emptied. He had become a ghost haunting the house he once commanded. But ghosts, too, have power. Every time his name was spoken, in Parliament, in pubs, in editorials, the air changed. People lowered their voices as though discussing something sacred or forbidden. The establishment had expelled him, but history had not. The philosopher alone. At night, in his modest Wolverhampton home, Powell sat surrounded by books and silence. His wife would find him staring out the window, a pen motionless in his hand. Once she asked, "Do you ever wish you had stayed quiet?" He turned to her, eyes calm, voice soft. "No. A man must choose between comfort and conviction. I have chosen conviction, and I will live with its solitude." He smiled faintly. "Besides," he added, "prophets are not made for peace." The legacy of the speech. The rivers of blood speech would follow him until his last breath. To some, it remained a courageous act of foresight. To others, a scar, a wound inflicted upon the moral fabric of Britain. But in the quiet space between condemnation and admiration lay something truer, that Powell had forced a complacent nation to confront its own unease, its own ghosts. He had shown Britain its reflection, and Britain had recoiled. "When I am gone," he said years later, "it will be said of me that I spoke the truth, though none wished to hear it." And so the voice that had once echoed through Parliament began to fade from politics, but not from history. The warning had been given. The storm, once released, could not be recalled. The speech had made him immortal, but it had also made him untouchable. In the weeks and months that followed, Enoch Powell was no longer simply a politician. He was a pariah, a headline, a symbol, a living controversy that walked and spoke and refused to apologize. His name carried both applause and venom. And to the quiet halls of Parliament, that made him unbearable. He had warned of chaos. The chaos had come for him instead. The exile within. After Edward Heath dismissed him, Powell returned to the back benches, physically present, spiritually removed. He still came to the House of Commons in his dark suits, his papers folded neatly, his expression unreadable. But he was no longer part of the conversation. When he rose to speak, his words fell into silence, or worse, polite indifference. He was shunned in public, whispered about in corridors, and rarely invited to speak at party events. He would enter the chamber and watch younger MPs turn away, unwilling to meet his eyes. He told a journalist later, "Exile is not only geographical, it can be moral. It can be the price one pays for seeing too clearly." He had been erased, not defeated, but dismissed, and that, to a man like Powell, was worse than any loss. The solitude of conviction. He retreated into his home in Wolverhampton, where his wife Pamela became both companion and witness to his melancholy. He still rose early each morning, shaved with military precision, and worked at his desk until evening. But the work had changed. No longer parliamentary notes or policy drafts. Now it was letters, essays, poems. His writing deepened, darkened. He began to sound like a man communing not with colleagues, but with ghosts. He returned to the classics, especially Tacitus and Thucydides, the historians of decline. He saw in their words his own fate, the voice of the rational man in an irrational age. He wrote in one notebook, "The punishment for truth is loneliness, but the reward is the same." Pamela would often find him staring at the fire, silent for hours. When she asked what he was thinking, he replied, "I'm remembering what England was, the people's hero." Yet while Westminster cast him out, the streets did not. He could no longer appear in public without drawing a crowd. Wherever he went, railway stations, markets, seaside promenades, working-class Britons followed him, shook his hand, thanked him for telling the truth. He was cheered by dockworkers, miners, pensioners, those who felt forgotten by the new global Britain. To them, he was not a racist or a villain. He was one of the last men who dared to say aloud what they feared to whisper. They called him the People's Prophet. It was a title he never asked for and never rejected. He told a reporter, "A politician who loses his party but keeps the people has not failed. He has changed his audience." But in his diary that night, he wrote only one line: "Adoration is a form of exile too." The death of belonging inside Parliament, he was now treated as a dangerous relic, brilliant but radioactive. The Conservative Party, eager to modernise under Heath and later Margaret Thatcher, distanced itself from him. To them, he was a ghost of an England that no longer existed or no longer wished to. He sat through debates, silent, his mind drifting elsewhere. He spoke occasionally on monetary policy, the European common market, and constitutional reform, always with logic, never with warmth. But everyone knew the passion that once drove him had been spent in that single, irrevocable speech. It had cost him everything. He had not only lost his career, he had lost his place in history's hierarchy. He would not be remembered as a prime minister or statesman, but as a warning. And yet, there was something defiant in that. He once told a friend, "Better to be a cautionary tale than a forgettable one." The long retreat. In the 1970s, Powell began to withdraw further from the political establishment. He turned increasingly against his own party, criticizing its stance on Europe. He believed the European Economic Community was the final betrayal, the surrender of British sovereignty to foreign powers. He warned that joining it would be the quiet death of the nation he had spent his life defending. "It is not through conquest," he said, "but through consent that we are losing our country." When his party ignored him, he did the unthinkable. He left the Conservatives entirely. It was the act of a man cutting the last tie to a world he could no longer recognize. The turn to Ulster. In 1974, he found a new home, in an unlikely place. He stood for election in Northern Ireland as a candidate for the Ulster Unionist Party and won. To many, it was shocking. To Powell, it was logical. He saw in Ulster a mirror of his own fears, a small, besieged community fighting to preserve identity against the tides of history. He moved there, embraced its people, and made their struggle his own. He called it the last bastion of Britishness. He served there for 15 years, giving long, solemn speeches about unity, faith, and the tragedy of division. He opposed the Good Friday precursors, fearing compromise with those he saw as enemies of continuity. His tone softened with age, but his conviction never did. To the end, he remained a man out of step with his time. The private burden. In private, Powell was haunted not by guilt, but by paradox. He knew that his words had caused pain, that they had been used to justify hatred he did not intend. And yet, he also believed that history had proven him right, at least in part. He once said to a journalist late in life, "I am not proud that my words have been twisted, but I am prouder still that they have not been forgotten." He refused to apologize, but neither did he rejoice. His conscience was not clean nor corrupted, it was heavy. His wife later said, "He did not regret the speech. He regretted the world's inability to hear it properly." The poet in winter. As the years passed, Powell turned inward once more. He published translations of Sophocles, Herodotus, and Virgil, returning to the dead who never judged him. He wrote a final collection of poetry, austere, tragic, and beautiful. In one poem, he described a man standing at the edge of a ruined city, watching the sea swallow the stones. "He does not weep," Powell wrote, "for he has seen the pattern before. He knows that the sea is patient, and man forgets too soon." It was both autobiography and epitaph. The Prophet of Solitude. By the late 1980s, Enoch Powell was largely forgotten by the establishment, but not by the people. He continued to receive hundreds of letters each year, from admirers, from critics, from the merely curious. He answered as many as he could, always in his spidery handwriting, always signed, "Yours sincerely, J.E. Powell." When asked near the end of his life whether he still believed himself right, he paused, then said, "I no longer know what right means in politics, but I know what it means in conscience." He had lost every title worth having, yet he had gained the one that mattered most to him: witness. "History," he said, "will judge me not by what I intended, but by what I revealed." And he knew what he had revealed: the brittleness of nations, the loneliness of truth, the tragedy of those who see too much, too soon, the man who would not repent. He died in 1998, aged 85, after a short illness. There were no state honors, no crowds, just a quiet funeral in London, attended by family and a few loyal friends. On his desk at home lay his last note, written days before his death. It read, "All men are wrong in the eyes of the present. The only question is, for which future will they be right?" The man who once stood in the House of Commons as Britain's fiercest voice had faded into history, neither hero nor villain, but something rarer. A man who refused to surrender the burden of thought to the comfort of the crowd. He had walked alone, as he always knew he would. "I see the world not as it wishes to be," he once said, "but as it is." And that perhaps is my tragedy. By the time Enoch Powell settled fully into the 1980s, his shadow had grown longer than his fame. He no longer belonged to politics, nor entirely to history. He existed in that quiet borderland where men who have spoken too much are left alone with their thoughts. He had become, as one journalist put it, a prophet in exile, still feared for the echoes of his own words. The fire that had once burned in the Chamber of Parliament was now a steady ember, glowing through age and solitude. He lived simply, spending his days surrounded by books, his evenings with his wife Pamela, who had learned long ago that his silence meant more than his speech. He had become the very thing he always predicted he would, a witness to the slow unraveling of the civilization he had loved too much to forgive. The scholar returns. In Northern Ireland, where he served as an Ulster Unionist MP, Powell found a strange peace amid conflict. The troubles raged outside, bombs, sirens, tension, yet he felt more at home among the siege-minded people of Ulster than in the glittering decay of London. They understood something he had always believed, that identity, once diluted, is easily lost. He saw in them a mirror of himself, steadfast, fearful, loyal to ghosts. He walked through Belfast in the early mornings, coat drawn tight against the wind, past walls marked by slogans and shrapnel. The people nodded, respectful, cautious. To them, he was not the infamous man from England. He was simply Mr. Powell, the scholar who quoted the Bible with the gravity of a priest and the precision of a mathematician. In church halls and small meetings, he spoke not of race or empire anymore, but of duty, faith, and history. He reminded them that nations survive not by power, but by memory. "Forget who you are," he told them once, "and you are already conquered." The applause was polite, but the silence that followed was deep, that rare silence that means understanding, the letters and the ghosts. Each week, hundreds of letters still found their way to his door. They came from England, from the Commonwealth, even from America. Some praised him as a man of truth, others cursed him as a man of ruin. He read them all carefully and placed them into neat piles, for reply, for thought, for fire. He would write by hand, using an old fountain pen that had survived the war. His words were measured, his tone gentle, his sentences built like architecture. Even to his harshest critics, he wrote with respect. One such letter ended with, "I am no enemy of men, only of forgetfulness, for what is history but the long memory of warning ignored." At night, when Pamela slept, he would sit by the fire and reread his own speeches, not with pride, but with curiosity. He treated them like ancient artifacts, as though they had been written by another man whose intentions he could no longer fully remember. He confessed once to a journalist, "There is a strange fate in being both the author and the subject of your own tragedy." The war in his mind. Though his body aged, his intellect remained fierce. Too fierce, perhaps, for peace. He still rose at dawn to translate Greek and Latin, still quoted Thucydides and Heraclitus aloud, as if invoking them to explain the modern world. But the more he read, the more he saw the same patterns repeating, the same arrogance, the same blindness, the same decline. To him, Britain had become a ghost of itself, its traditions diluted, its institutions hollow, its pride turned to irony. He did not hate his country, he mourned it. He once said to a visiting journalist, "I sometimes feel like a man watching the tide pull back before the final wave. The beach is calm, the air is clear, and yet I know what comes next." He smiled faintly after saying it, as if he had accepted the futility of his own foresight, the memory of war. Even as age softened his body, his dreams remained violent. He would wake in the night sweating, hearing artillery, the faint hum of bombers, voices shouting in German. The war had never left him, it simply changed shape. In his waking hours, that war became metaphor, the struggle between memory and modernity. He believed that every generation must fight its own moral battle, and that Britain's battle was against indifference. In an interview in 1986, he said quietly, "We live now not in an age of courage or cruelty, but of evasion. People no longer believe in good or evil, only in convenience. That is how nations die, not by invasion, but by laughter." It was one of his last public remarks, but it revealed everything, the sadness of a man who had loved a world that no longer existed, and the loneliness of knowing it would never return. The philosopher of loss. He began to write essays, not political manifestos, but reflections on language, history, and mortality. He wrote about the Latin poets, about the decay of grammar, about how precision in speech mirrors precision in thought. In one essay he wrote, "A civilization dies when its words no longer fit its world." His students, those who had once studied him in silence, now quoted him in their own classrooms, often without realizing the pain behind his clarity. For Powell, language was not merely communication, it was remembrance. And as English changed, softened, and globalized, he felt the very foundations of meaning slipping away. He often said, "When a people forgets how to name what it loves, it forgets how to love it." The quiet evenings. In Londonderry, he and Pamela lived a modest life. Their home smelled of paper and dust, filled with books stacked like old soldiers at rest. There was no television. The radio played softly, classical music, sometimes the news, though he would often turn it off mid-broadcast. He spent his afternoons walking through the garden, reciting Latin verse under his breath. Sometimes he would pause, close his eyes, and whisper to himself lines from Virgil, "Sunt lacrimae rerum, et mentem mortalia tangunt." There are tears in things, and mortality touches the mind. When he repeated it aloud, Pamela would listen quietly, knowing that for him, the line was not poetry, but truth. The letters to eternity. As his health began to fail, Powell grew introspective. He wrote fewer letters, but those he did send were long, reflective, and strangely tender. He no longer sought to persuade, only to explain. One of his final correspondences ended with the words, "I do not know if I have been right or wrong. Perhaps I have been both, as all men are who speak before their time. But I hope that when England remembers me, it will be as one who loved her too much, not too little." His handwriting trembled, but his mind remained razor-sharp until the end. The twilight. In his final years, Powell appeared less frequently in public. He refused interviews, declined honors, and avoided all discussion of rehabilitation. He was not interested in redemption. He believed that history itself would deliver the only judgment that mattered. Time, he said, is the only impartial historian. And time, he knew, moves slowly. He spent his last birthday surrounded by a few friends and students. When asked what he desired most, he smiled and said, "A quiet century." The closing circle. As the 1990s approached, Powell's influence had faded from politics, but his presence lingered like an echo in the nation's subconscious. His words, once condemned, began to reappear in debates, books, and interviews, often quoted, often distorted. He had become myth, and like all myths, he was both truth and warning. He lived to see his fears return in new forms. Unrest, division, disillusionment, and met them not with vindication, but sorrow. He whispered to a friend in his final months, "I wanted to save England from herself. Instead, I became a reminder that she could still feel fear." He laughed softly afterward, a dry, knowing laugh, the laughter of a man who had long since made peace with his own ghost. "In the end," he once wrote, "I will not be remembered as I was, but that is well, for every man becomes what his time needs him to be, whether he wills it or not." The scholar who once dreamed of Rome had lived to see his own empire fade, his own name turn to symbol, his own warnings become history. And as he drifted into the twilight of his years, he carried with him not bitterness, but inevitability. For Powell had always believed that to understand fate is not to escape it. It is to greet it calmly as an old friend. In his last decade, Enoch Powell became what he had always secretly been, not a politician, not a prophet, but a poet haunted by history. The fire of Parliament had cooled to embers, yet in those quiet embers glowed a strange beauty, the kind that burns without heat. He no longer sought to argue, nor to persuade. He had said what he came to say. Now he wished to understand what it had cost him. Each day he sat at his small wooden desk in Londonderry, writing with slow precision, the nib of his fountain pen scratching against thick paper. He wrote not for publication, but for posterity, for that invisible reader beyond time who might one day look back and see him clearly without love or hatred. The words that emerged were not manifestos. They were meditations, fragments of philosophy, letters to ghosts, elegies for empires. He had become his own historian, documenting the fall of the world he loved and the quiet survival of its spirit in his own mind. The man who saw too far, he had spent a lifetime seeing too much. Where others saw events, he saw patterns. Where others celebrated progress, he sensed the trembling beneath it. He had once told a journalist that the true philosopher must live half a century ahead of his own time, and that to do so was a curse. "I was born out of season," he said, "and I shall die in it." Now, in his 80s, he began to see that the curse had become a kind of peace. The world had moved on, forgetting the wars, the warnings, the speeches, all of it receding into the haze of nostalgia and revision. And Powell, for the first time in his life, no longer resisted it. He had come to accept that he was not meant to be understood. His role had never been to lead, but to remind. To bear witness to the unchanging rhythm of human history, rise, pride, forgetfulness, decline. "There is no tragedy greater than progress without memory," he wrote. "It builds machines but forgets why men ever dreamed." The last writings. His notebooks from these years reveal a man stripped of illusion, but not of wonder. They are filled with reflections on the nature of time, death, and the frailty of civilizations. He wrote of Rome again, but now not as symbol, as kin. He saw himself in its philosophers, old men in fading empires, preserving meaning through words, while the streets outside filled with noise and change. He translated Virgil's Aeneid once more, line by line, pausing often as if listening for something only he could hear. When asked why he returned to the same text for the 100th time, he said, "Because it is the only poem that understands loss as a duty." He saw in Aeneas, the man carrying his father out of the ruins of Troy, the perfect metaphor for his own life, a man condemned to bear the weight of memory through the ruins of his age. The language of mourning. To those who visited him, Powell seemed both diminished and luminous. His once intense eyes had softened, though the clarity within them never dimmed. When he spoke, his sentences were deliberate, as if he were dictating to eternity. He talked of words more than politics. He feared that modern English was losing its moral edge, that people no longer meant what they said. Language, he told a young student, is not the servant of thought. It is its master. When you lose the meaning of words, you lose the meaning of yourself. He recited Latin epigrams as though invoking old gods, Horace, Juvenal, Cicero, their laments for a world slipping into decadence. It was as though he were preparing not for death, but for translation, from man into myth, from noise into silence. The inner pilgrimage. Each morning he walked to the edge of the river near his home, cane in hand, coat drawn tight. The river was quiet there, grey and slow, reflecting the low clouds like polished steel. He would stand for a long time, motionless, murmuring lines of poetry or prayer. Sometimes, if the light was right, he could see his reflection and mistake it for the boy he once was, the child of empire, the scholar of Cambridge, the soldier of war. And then the image would ripple and vanish, and he would smile faintly, as though the water itself had corrected his vanity. He later wrote, "The self is a tide, it comes, it goes, and what remains is the shore of the soul." That river became his chapel. Each visit was a ritual of reconciliation between the man he was, the man he became, and the man history insisted he had been. The legacy of loneliness. In the public imagination, Powell remained frozen in 1968, the voice of fear, the architect of controversy. But the private Powell, the man of these shadow years, was something else entirely. He was gentle. He wrote letters of condolence to widows and poems to old friends. He visited local schools to speak about Latin, not politics. He donated his personal library to universities across Ireland and England. When one reporter asked if he missed the grandeur of Parliament, he smiled. "Grand things are always smaller on the inside," he said. He no longer sought applause or correction. He had realized that those who live by conviction must eventually live without companions. "It is the law of prophets," he wrote, "to outlive the ears that once heard them." The Poetic Testament. One of his final works, unpublished until after his death, was a long prose poem titled "The Last England." It reads like an epitaph for both nation and self. "I dreamed of an island that was once a kingdom, and of a people who mistook comfort for virtue. I saw them build towers of glass and forget their fathers' graves. I saw their children speak a language that remembered no prayers. And when I wept, the sea replied, 'You are too late, but not wrong.' It was not anger that filled those lines, but grief, the grief of a man watching his civilization grow modern without growing wise. There was no bitterness left in him, only recognition. He no longer feared the future. He had simply stopped expecting it to learn. The reconciliation. In his last interviews, he spoke more softly than ever before. He no longer defended his speech, nor recanted it. He simply accepted that it had become something larger than him, a mirror of Britain's own conscience, distorted by time and misunderstanding. "My words were born in fear and in love," he said, "and those are the two oldest languages in the world." When asked if he still loved his country, he replied, "I never stopped. I only wished she had loved herself as much." Those who had once despised him found themselves moved by the old man's serenity. He was no longer the thunder of the commons. He was a whisper, an elegy, the last echo of a voice from another England. The final reflection. As his health declined, Powell wrote less. He spent long hours staring out the window, the same distant look he'd worn as a child reading Virgil by candlelight. He had come full circle, from the empire's dawn to its dust. He said once to Pamela, "I have seen what I was meant to see." And that, my dear, is all that a man can ask. When he could no longer write, he dictated short fragments to her. The last of them read, "History is not kind or cruel, it is indifferent, but if one man can keep a single memory alive, then history has not won." He died quietly, without ceremony, in February 1998. Outside, the rain fell over London, steady, grey and endless, like a requiem. His books were still open on the table, his pen resting on the final page. On it were written 5 words, underlined once: "To remember is to resist." The scholar had become the soldier, the prophet, and the prophet finally the poet, not of victory, but of vanishing. In the end, Enoch Powell became what he had always feared and desired most: a man turned to myth, an echo across an empire of forgetting. The 1970s were years of smoke and uncertainty, years when bombs echoed through Belfast, when streets burned with slogans and songs, when old loyalties turned into battle lines. To most English politicians, Northern Ireland was a distant tragedy, a place too complicated, too haunted to understand. But to Enoch Powell, it was something different. It was the last fragment of the England he believed in, austere, loyal, and bound by faith. When he crossed the Irish Sea to stand as a candidate for the Ulster Unionist Party, people thought him mad, a disgraced Englishman entering a conflict not his own. But Powell saw in Ulster the same struggle that had defined his entire life, the war between continuity and change, between tradition and dissolution. He believed that if Britain still had a heartbeat, it pulsed here, in this wounded, defiant corner of its old empire. The man from England. When he first arrived in Belfast, reporters followed him like vultures. He stepped off the plane in a dark coat and hat, briefcase in hand, moving with the rigid precision of a man who had already measured every consequence. At the press line, someone shouted, "Mr. Powell, why Ireland?" He stopped, met the man's eyes, and answered, "Because Britain still lives here, though she does not know it." The words appeared in every newspaper the next day. To some, they were stirring. To others, proof that Powell was once again chasing ghosts. But those who met him in person saw something they did not expect: humility. He listened more than he spoke, asked questions in detail, learned names, read local newspapers cover to cover. He understood that loyalty here was not abstract. It was a language of blood and belonging. He did not pretend to be one of them, but he respected what they were. And in that respect, he found belonging again. The House divided. At Stormont, where the Ulster Assembly met, Powell carried himself as though he were walking through an ancient temple. He saw in every speech, every vote, a moral drama, civilization fighting against chaos. He condemned the IRA with quiet fury, calling terrorism the politics of despair disguised as courage. Yet he also criticized the British government for its distant arrogance, its ignorance of the complexities of faith and fear. He stood apart from every faction. He would not hate the Catholics, nor flatter the Protestants. He simply called for discipline, duty, and an understanding that identity, like freedom, must be earned through restraint. A nation, he told the assembly, cannot exist by sentiment. It must exist by self-respect. Some in the chamber rolled their eyes, others whispered that the old lion still had his claws. A place of mirrors. Powell came to see Ulster as both tragedy and sanctuary. Here, the questions he had asked all his life were written across the streets. Who are we? Who belongs? What must we sacrifice to endure? The answers were painful, but they were honest. In the crumbling churches, in the songs of mourning, in the children carrying both fear and pride in their eyes, he saw echoes of the England of his youth. He would visit small towns and walk among ordinary people, stopping to speak quietly with shopkeepers, farmers, widows. They were cautious at first. They knew his name, his reputation, but his manner disarmed them. He was polite, deeply attentive, almost pastoral. He remembered details about their lives, asked about their sons in the army, their daughters in school. He would quote the Book of Common Prayer as easily as Virgil, leaving them unsure whether they had spoken to a politician or a preacher. Faith reclaimed. In Ulster, Powell's Anglican faith, long intellectualized, long hidden behind logic, found new life. The hymns, the solemn prayers, the ritual of endurance in the face of violence, all of it touched something that war and politics had burned away. He began to speak more often of God, not as abstraction, but as presence. He told a friend, "I no longer see providence as the hand that guides history. I see it as the silence that allows men to choose." On Sundays, he attended church with Pamela, kneeling with the same rigor he once brought to the battlefield and the lecture hall. When asked what he prayed for, he answered that England might remember how to kneel. The press mocked him for it, but he did not care. Faith for him had become not hope, but acceptance. The watcher of storms. The troubles continued through the 1980s, claiming lives almost daily. Powell watched with quiet horror as ideology turned young men into martyrs and enemies into monsters. He began to deliver speeches that few expected from him, speeches of restraint, compassion, reconciliation. He spoke not of conquest, but of mercy. He urged Protestants to forgive without surrender, and Catholics to remember without hate. The future, he said, will belong not to those who shout, but to those who endure. The audience listened in stunned silence. Even those who disagreed could not dismiss him. Here was the man once accused of dividing a nation, now pleading for a divided land to remain whole. Some called it irony, others called it redemption. Powell called it simply the logic of love. The reluctant prophet. As his health began to fade, he often said that he had come to Ulster not to save it, but to understand himself. And in that understanding he had found peace, though not comfort. He once told a local priest, "All my life I thought of civilization as a wall, but perhaps it is a candle, something we must shield with our hands until the wind passes." He knew now that his life's work had been both preservation and mourning, the attempt to hold a flame against the inevitable dark. He no longer wanted victory, he wanted clarity. The private man. At home, he lived quietly. He gardened, wrote letters, read the Psalms each evening. He and Pamela would sit by the fire, listening to classical music, rarely speaking, content in shared silence. Sometimes he would quote scripture softly, "Teach us to number our days, that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom." It was the verse that had followed him from boyhood to old age, from the Birmingham classroom to the Indian desert, from Parliament to exile. In those twilight years, the anger had gone. Only awe remained, awe at the beauty and cruelty of the world he had spent his life trying to understand. The last campaign. Even as illness crept in, Powell continued to serve as an MP, refusing retirement until 1987. He said that one should leave public life as one entered it, by conviction, not convenience. His final speech in the House was subdued, but luminous. He quoted Heraclitus for the last time. "The way upward and the way downward are one and the same." Then he added his own reflection. "In the end, all nations are mirrors. We see in them not what they are, but what we have become." When he sat down, there was a long silence. Even his old opponents nodded in respect. The boy from Birmingham, the scholar of Cambridge, the soldier, the poet, the exile, had finally finished speaking. The quiet farewell. When he left Northern Ireland for the last time in the winter of 1987, the air was cold and wet, the sea restless. He stood on the ferry deck and looked back toward the grey hills, the small lights of Belfast shimmering through the mist. He whispered, not to anyone, but to himself, "I have found what I came here to find, the courage to lose without despair." Then he turned, coat billowing in the wind, and walked away. He would never return. "There are no victories for those who fight time," he wrote later. "There is only the grace of having fought." The soldier of empire had become a man of faith. The prophet of division had become a poet of endurance. And in that contradiction, in that soft acceptance, the long tragedy of Enoch Powell found its quietest, most human truth. In the end, Enoch Powell lived long enough to watch himself become history. He saw his face appear in documentaries and newspapers, always the same image, the severe eyes, the neat hair, the faint, cold smile of a man frozen in controversy. He was no longer asked for opinions, only for reflections. He obliged rarely, and when he did, his voice carried no anger, only the quiet fatigue of a man who had already outlived judgment. He had given his final parliamentary speech in 1987, yet his real last speech, the one he would deliver not to colleagues but to eternity, was still being written. He wrote it every morning in fragments on scraps of paper, in margins of books, in letters to no one. It was not a defense, nor a confession. It was an act of reconciliation. He was trying, finally, to make peace with himself. The fading of time age had thinned him to shadow. His once quick stride had slowed to a careful shuffle. His voice, once sharp enough to cut through Parliament, had become gentle and low. The same mind that had terrified ministers and confounded interviewers remained intact. Every date, every quotation, every Greek verb recalled as if written yesterday. But his body betrayed him. Arthritis gnawed at his hands, his heart weakened, and the world around him, technological, multicultural, loud, had grown unrecognizable. The England he had spent his life defending no longer existed, at least not in the form he had known. He did not resent this. He simply observed it with a scholar's calm curiosity, as though studying an ancient species in decline. "Time," he told a visiting journalist, "is a tide that carries all things away. The wise man learns not to swim against it, but to float, upright if he can." The interviews. He rarely granted interviews, but when he did, reporters found him strangely serene. The firebrand of the 1960s had become a philosopher of impermanence. He spoke in slow sentences, as though every word were a farewell. "You see," he said once, "the point is not whether I was right or wrong. The point is that I believed a nation could still choose its destiny. That belief, I think, has died." He smiled faintly, not in bitterness, but in recognition. Another interviewer, younger and more provocative, asked him, "Do you still believe in England?" Powell looked out the window before answering. "Believe in her? Yes. But belief is not the same as faith. Faith forgives, belief remembers." It was the most concise summary of his life anyone could have written. The visits, as his health declined, he received fewer guests. But those who came, students, writers, even old adversaries, found him generous. He offered tea, spoke softly, and never once mentioned his own speeches unless asked. To a group of young scholars he said, Do not study me as a politician. Study me as an example of what happens when a man loves ideas more than comfort." They asked if he had any regrets. He thought for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I regret that I spoke as if history were mathematics. It is not. It is poetry, full of contradictions, full of grace. That was the closest he ever came to repentance." The last debates. Even in his frailty, he followed the news. He would listen to the radio, sometimes shaking his head at what he heard. When the Berlin Wall fell, he whispered, "Another empire dies, and another will be born." When Britain debated Europe again in the early 1990s, he wrote a final essay warning against the illusion of shared destiny. It was published quietly, buried in a small academic journal, but it read like a ghost speaking from the past. In one of his final public letters, he wrote, "To be European is not to be English, any more than to be modern is to be wise. The strength of a people lies in its memory. Forgetfulness is the beginning of exile." His pen trembled as he wrote, but his conviction never did. The hospital bed. By the winter of 1997, his body had become too weak to ignore. He was admitted to King Edward VII's Hospital in London. Doctors found his mind astonishingly clear. He corrected one nurse's Latin inscription on a medical form and quoted Horace while being examined. When an old friend visited, Powell said, smiling, "The Greeks were right to call the body a vessel. It leaks, it breaks, but it carries the soul faithfully to the shore." Pamela stayed by his side, holding his hand as he drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes he murmured verses, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in English, often about rivers, time, and silence. The nurses didn't understand, but they felt the rhythm of the words, as if prayer had disguised itself as poetry. The final visitors. A few days before the end, 2 former students visited him. They brought a copy of Herodotus, the same translation he had used at Cambridge 50 years earlier. They read aloud to him, and his eyes lit up with recognition. "You see," he whispered, "even the ancients knew. The gods do not punish men for their evil, but for their blindness." He drifted off after that, his breathing shallow, his expression calm. It was as though he had finally found a truth he had chased across decades. The last speech. On his final night, he asked for pen and paper. Pamela handed him a notepad, expecting a letter or verse. Instead, he wrote a few lines, clear, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "We speak and are forgotten, but the echo lives on. That is enough." He set the pen down, closed his eyes, and whispered a single Latin word, domum. Home. He died quietly moments later as dawn broke over London. The rain had stopped. The sky was pale grey, the colour of calm acceptance. The funeral. There was no grand state ceremony, no marble tomb, just a small church service attended by family, a few old colleagues, and those who still felt drawn to the mystery of his life. The hymns were simple, the readings chosen by Pamela. One was from Ecclesiastes, "To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven." When the coffin was lowered into the ground, a gust of wind stirred the trees outside, scattering petals like snow. A journalist who had once despised him stood silently in the back, hat in hand. Later, he wrote, "He left as he lived, alone, dignified, unrepentant, and aware of the shadows he cast." The silence after. For months after his death, his name reappeared in headlines, debates, and think pieces. Some praised him as a man of vision, others damned him as the embodiment of intolerance. But time, as he had always said, has its own patience. Slowly the shouting faded, and in that silence, a new kind of understanding began to form. Not forgiveness, not admiration, but recognition of complexity. People began to read his speeches again, not as prophecy or sin, but as literature, as the tragic poetry of a mind wrestling with impermanence. One critic wrote, In an age of slogans, he spoke in sentences. In an age of comfort, he sought meaning. He was never at peace with the world, but perhaps at the end, he was at peace with himself. The truest speeches, Powell had once said, are not heard in Parliament. They are spoken into the silence of time. But now that silence was all that remained. The man who had lived by words had given his last. The empire he had mourned was long gone. The rivers had stopped foaming. Only memory flowed on. History is never kind, but it is patient. When the last mourners had left the churchyard and the reporters filed their final lines, Enoch Powell began his second life, not in flesh, but in memory. The man who had once sat in the front bench of Parliament became something less tangible and more enduring, a riddle, a symbol, a shadow cast across the century he helped to define. To speak his name was to summon argument. To read his words was to meet a mind both brilliant and brutal. To remember him was to remember what Britain once feared and what it still feared becoming, a mirror of the nation. In the decades after his death, Britain continued to change. The world he had fought to preserve vanished almost completely. The empire reduced to nostalgia, the pound sharing its power with Europe, the streets filled with languages that had never before echoed under London's grey skies. Yet his ghost lingered. Whenever the country argued about identity, immigration, or sovereignty, Powell's words, or a distortion of them, returned. His name appeared in headlines, in campaign speeches, in angry letters to editors, sometimes as warning, sometimes as weapon. But those who invoked him often missed the truth, that Powell was less a cause than a symptom, the embodiment of an anxiety older than empire, older even than England itself, the fear of forgetting who one is. A nation is a story, he had written, and the end begins when it forgets the opening line. For some, that line made him prophet, for others, relic. But for history, he became both, the making of a legend. As the years passed, Powell's life was retold again and again, in documentaries, biographies, and quiet university seminars. In each version, the emphasis shifted. The scholar of Cambridge, the brigadier of war, the poet, the prophet, the villain. He became a mirror through which Britain examined its own conscience. Scholars debated his warnings, poets quoted his melancholy, politicians borrowed his language even when they disowned his conclusions. His most famous speech, once condemned, began to be studied in literature departments, not as politics, but as tragedy. Students analyzed its cadence, its Virgilian echo, its mournful tone. They realized that it was not the speech of a zealot, but of a classicist mourning his civilization. He spoke, one historian wrote, as a Roman watching the aqueducts crumble. And in that realization, a strange sympathy began to form. Not approval, not forgiveness, but understanding. The two Enochs. There were by now two Enoch Powells. The first was the public ghost, the rivers of blood Powell, the taboo, the symbol of division. This Powell lived on in headlines and debates, conjured by those who sought either validation or condemnation. The second was the private Powell, the poet, the scholar, the lonely moralist who had seen too much of history's cruelty and wanted to spare his country its repetition. This Powell survived in letters, diaries, and the memories of those who knew him. Pamela, his widow, once said quietly to a biographer, "He was never the man they said he was. He loved too deeply to hate. That was his undoing." Her words did little to change the public myth, but they revealed the truth behind it. Powell's life was not one of malice, but of mourning. He had not feared others. He had feared loss, the loss of meaning, of identity, of coherence. And that fear, spoken aloud, became too large for the age he lived in to contain. The judgment of time. Time did what Powell could not. It softened everything. The anger faded, the condemnations grew academic. Younger generations, with no memory of the speech or its shockwaves, encountered his words with curiosity rather than outrage. They found in them a strange beauty, a man out of time speaking the language of a fallen world. Historians began to write of him not as a political failure, but as a tragic figure, a man who mistook insight for destiny, who saw history too clearly to live comfortably within it. One historian wrote, "He was right about the pattern, wrong about the people. He understood the past perfectly, but not the heart." And yet, even that judgment seemed too simple, because the power of Enoch Powell's story was never in his correctness. It was in his conviction, the rare and terrible clarity of a man who refused to lie to himself. The books he left behind. After his death, scholars catalogued his papers, thousands of pages of speeches, poems, and notes written in his precise, slanted handwriting. Among them were drafts of lectures never delivered, letters never sent, fragments of translations from Herodotus, Virgil, and the Psalms. In one unfinished note found among his papers, he had written, "Man makes empires. God makes ruins, and the ruins are more honest." The archivists paused over that line. It was not political. It was spiritual. The confession of a man who had come to see collapse not as punishment, but as purification. In another notebook, a single line stood alone on the final page. Perhaps the task of the thinker is not to prevent the fall, but to make it understood. That sentence became the epigraph of his collected writings. The nation he left behind. When the new millennium dawned, Britain had changed beyond recognition. It was multicultural, global, comfortable, and still uncertain of itself. Its people spoke easily of tolerance, yet still argued about belonging. Its politicians avoided prophecy, preferring polls to philosophy. And through it all, the ghost of Enoch Powell remained. Not shouting, not judging, merely watching. He had become the shadow behind every conversation about identity, not as a man to imitate, but as a question to answer. His life was a mirror that asked each new generation, what does it mean to belong? What is lost when we forget our story? And can a nation love itself without fearing others? No one ever answered those questions fully, but perhaps that was the point. The eternal return. In the final reckoning, Enoch Powell's life resembled the tragedies he loved. Like Oedipus, he sought truth and was destroyed by finding it. Like Aeneas, he carried his civilization's memory through its ashes. And like all tragic heroes, he mistook the clarity of vision for the power to change fate. He had warned of rivers foaming with blood, but what truly ran red was his own reputation. Sacrificed on the altar of conviction, he had wanted to save England from oblivion. Instead, he ensured that England could never forget him. Every prophet, he once wrote, becomes his own cautionary tale. And so he did. The myth in the end, Enoch Powell became less a man and more a myth. The eternal English Cassandra, condemned to speak truths too harsh for his time, remembered not for the world he loved, but for the wound he left upon it. To some, he remains the voice of warning. To others, the voice of fear. To history, he remains the sound of a civilization questioning itself, the echo of empire's conscience, reciting one last poem into the dark. "There are tears in things," he had often quoted from Virgil, "and mortality touches the mind." Those words, more than any of his own, became his epitaph. For in the vast, slow unfolding of British history, among kings and soldiers, poets and politicians, Enoch Powell stands alone, a man who loved too fiercely, who thought too deeply, and who spoke too soon. The last line. In a quiet archive in Belfast, one of his handwritten notes still sits under glass. It contains no rhetoric, no prophecy, only a single sentence written in trembling ink. "If they remember nothing else, let them remember that I cared." It is signed simply, E. Powell. And with that, the myth becomes man again. History, he had said, is not a verdict but a voice. We all must answer to it in our own time. The voice of Enoch Powell still answers, not with anger now, but with the low, endless hum of memory. Neither saint nor monster, only what he always was, a man trying to hold the line between the world that was and the world that is. Thus ends the storm in the empire, the life of Enoch Powell, a story of brilliance and exile, of fear and fidelity, of one man's impossible attempt to save a civilization from the thing no one can save it from: time.